The previous video, part 7, entitled Barkers and Gevedons in the Civil War, War's Realities, ended with a large Union army heading up the New River Valley near Princeton, West Virginia in early May 1862, threatening a railroad and salt mine, both vital to the Confederate cause. General Marshall had quickly deployed his army to protect the assets. On other fronts, the Confederate Navy's steam-powered wooden frigate Merrimac, that had been converted into the celebrated ironclad CSS Virginia, was scuttled by the rebels when they abandoned Norfolk, Virginia, rather than have it fall into Union hands, but not before sinking 2 Union ships and famously dueling the Union ironclad Monitor to a draw at Hampton's Roads. Naval warfare would never be the same. On May 5th, in another war on the continent, Mexican forces defeated a larger French army at the Battle of Puebla that would begin the annual Cinco de Mayo celebration observed today. On May 8th, General Cox made a strategic error in his plan to capture the rail line by dividing his forces, sending the 23rd Ohio Infantry, that included 2 more future presidents, Rutherford B. Hayes and William McKinley, on towards Pearisburg while veering the rest of his men up the East River to camp just south of Princeton at present-day Oakville. He had underestimated the 2 Confederate divisions in his way, one under Marshall and the other under General Heth, moving down the New River Valley toward him. The next day, General Heth took advantage of Cox's mistake and routed the Federals in a daring night raid, causing them to retreat to Oakville, and Cox's entire army withdrew to Princeton. Cox followed with another tactical blunder the next day by sending out 11 companies on a reconnaissance mission, leaving Princeton poorly defended. Marshall moved his army toward Princeton, and by the 14th he was within striking distance east of Tazewell, with his force of 2,295 men. Heth's army remained at Pearisburg. The next day, Garrett wrote, quote, "Rose at 4:30 and prepared to move. The whole camp is full of bustle and excitement. The immediate prospects of a battle renders men weak and sickly. I see the largest and stoutest looking pale as death and quivering as an aspen." Unquote. The evening of the 16th, Marshall's forces reached the outskirts of Princeton to find about 1,200 Union soldiers defending the town, with an additional several hundred forward pickets guarding the approach. Incredibly, it appeared that Marshall's arrival had gone unnoticed, so he decided to attack immediately. Colonel Hawkins recounted, quote, "Williams ordered a halt and directed the 5th Kentucky to advance to the front, thus giving his old regiment the post of honor and danger." Unquote. Garrett wrote, quote, "Williams' regiment, the 5th, to the center, Trigg's 54th the right, and Moore's 29th the left, and moved on to town. Here and now, for the first time in my life, I heard the death song of the murderous Minnie Ball, which whizzed all around us. Our men drove back the enemy, reluctantly retreating on the town. They fought very valiantly, but could not withstand the onset and fierce rushing and loud huzzas of the Ragamuffin Regiment. All over the ground lay dead and wounded Yankees." Unquote. George Noble would later recount, quote, "We double-quick timed about 4 miles and met the enemy, and the firing began. The 5th Kentucky was in the advance, and every now and then we would pass a dead man. The soldiers would pull off his boots, take his watch, and search his pockets. Lieutenant Godkins said, 'Clean up.' The enemy was firing and falling back, and taking position in every good place where they had shelter from the bullets, and they were pouring bullets at us very fast. The 5th Kentucky was ordered out. There was a Virginia regiment on either side of the 5th Kentucky, and I could not tell where the cavalry was. It was not long until the cannons fired. It was about half dark and a half-mile to town. Just at dusk we were ordered to fix bayonets. The cannons already had ceased roaring, for we were getting nearly to town." Unquote. Colonel Hawkins again, quote, "Williams ordered his men to charge and drove the enemy from every position in such rapid succession that the 29th Virginia did not have a chance to fire a gun." Unquote. Later that evening, the 5th Kentucky and 54th Virginia Infantry regiments made a final push into Princeton itself, the 54th receiving the most resistance that lit up the night sky with gunfire. By 10 p.m., the rebels were in full possession of the town that had been hastily abandoned by the Federals, leaving 60 tents, some with candles still burning in them. A few hours later in the early morning, after collecting spoils, the rebels were ordered to retreat to a commanding hill overlooking the town, seen here from the south. The 5th Kentucky is in red, but the exact location of each regiment is uncertain. Cox immediately reoccupied Princeton as the sun was rising. Noble said, quote, "We drew rations and were cooking and eating when about 8 o'clock the guard came along by us with 12 prisoners and said the town was blue with Yankees. I could not eat any more because it had such an effect on me. When the news was carried through the camp, I could see the men running with their pants down every way to ease themselves. For the news affects a man's whole life and even moves his bowels," unquote. Union cannon opened up about 9 a.m., shelling Confederate positions. About the same time, Colonel Wharton arrived from Wytheville with 850 men of the 51st Virginia Infantry Regiment. It was immediately attacked by von Blessing's Germans of the 37th Ohio Infantry, returning from a reconnaissance mission. The Confederates quickly formed a defensive position on Pigeon's Roost Hill and caught the Germans in a murderous crossfire. The attack killed 20 Federals and wounded twice as many. Von Blessing withdrew and gathered his scattered regiment and took them in a wide arc to the east, and arrived in Princeton later that day, swelling the Union forces to between 4,000 and 5,000. The rebel strength was about half that. Marshall decided to wait until the arrival of Heth's division, but unknown to him, Heth had gotten within 5 miles and retreated under false information that Marshall had withdrawn from Princeton. They were now on their own. Noble said that later in the day, quote, "We marched out in sight of a field and saw General Williams and his staff in the field with a white flag. General Cox had sent the flag and asked them to take their wounded off the battleground and bury their dead. It was accepted, and they came with the ambulances and began to move the wounded. We were commanded to stack our arms and go over to the battlefield if we chose to do so. Many of us did," unquote. The next morning, May 18th, the rebels awoke to find that General Cox had retreated from Princeton with his entire army. Noble again, quote, "General Cox undertook to save his army, for General Heth had been ordered to Princeton to meet General Marshall and capture the whole Yankee army, but they did not make the connection. Marshall's army camped on the battleground that night. The next day, they buried the dead Yankees. They dug a long trench and threw them into it and covered them up. General Cox was not caring for the dead. He just wanted to save the living. Our army remained there for 3 days. I had fought the great battle at Princeton, and I felt that the victory was as much to my honor as it was to General Marshall," unquote. Cox was fortunate that General Heth was unable to fully communicate with Marshall, or his entire army might have been captured in a pincer movement. As it was, the Union suffered 23 killed, 69 wounded, and 23 missing or captured. The Confederates only 4 dead and 12 wounded. It was the first clear-cut victory for Marshall and the 5th Kentucky Infantry. Both the rail line and salt mine at Saltville remained in Confederate hands the rest of the war. It was one of the few bright spots for the Confederacy to that point in the war, amidst an endless procession of bad news and hardship. 3 days after the Battle of Princeton, the youngest Gevedon brother, Joseph, died. It is not known if it was from a battle wound or if he had been left to die in the hospital at Holston Springs, sent home to die, or had been captured sometime earlier and died in a prison camp. Whatever the case, he was buried in the Gevedon family cemetery at Grassy Creek, Morgan County, and a military marker has recently been added by a Confederate Graves organization. Meanwhile, the weather was improving, and so were Confederate prospects, but the 5th Kentucky was still a long way from home and family. Would they ever see Kentucky again during this interminable war? Look for part 9 in this video series.